15-year-old daughter uses a wheelchair. She was sitting in our backyard on a warm summer evening, enjoying the fire pit with a few marshmallows. She loves watching the flames dance and feeling the heat on her face. It was a quiet, happy night. Then Karen from the HOA sneaked into our yard earlier that day. She poured extra lighter fluid all over the fire pit wood when no one was looking. She was angry because we had a small fire without asking the HOA first. She said backyard fires made the neighborhood look cheap and broke safety rules. That night, when I lit the fire for Emily, the flames shot up huge and fast. Fire jumped onto her blanket and clothes. She screamed in pain as the fire burned her. Her scared eyes looked for me through the smoke. Karen watched from behind her fence and smiled meanly. Now they'll learn no fires allowed, she said to herself. She looked very proud. She did not know the strong man running from the house with a fire blanket and extinguisher was my daughter's father, a fire department chief, home early from the station. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. Emily sat cross-legged in her wheelchair on the patio, wrapped snugly in her favorite blanket. A marshmallow stick rested loosely across her lap, and she watched the small fire pit with a quiet fascination. Flames licked the edges of the logs, dancing and curling upward in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. The night air was warm, carrying the faint scent of grass and the distant hum of crickets. The sky above was deepening to navy blue, with stars beginning to appear one by one, delicate pinpricks of light in the vastness. For Emily, nights like this were perfect. She loved the way the flames moved unpredictably yet gracefully, the way they reflected in her eyes, the warmth against her face. These were moments when the world slowed down, when she could be just herself without worrying about schedules, school, or the tiny judgments that sometimes crept from neighbors' comments. Her father stood a few feet away, casually adjusting the fire pit's logs before striking the lighter. Years of experience told him a fire's danger was never about the logs themselves. It was in the fuel, in the way the fire responded. But tonight everything felt off before the flame even caught. The lighter clicked. A small spark leapt toward the wood. Normally the flames would spread gradually, a gentle crescendo of light and heat, but this time the fire erupted almost instantly. It roared higher than it should have, flames stretching upward with an unnatural energy. The wood seemed to burn faster, hotter, brighter than ever before, as though it had been waiting, primed for ignition. Emily's eyes widened. The fire didn't flicker gently, it flared. She instinctively pulled her blanket tighter, her small hands gripping the edges, unsure whether the warmth she loved was about to become too much. Her father's instincts kicked in immediately. This fire is wrong. He stepped forward without hesitation, positioning himself between Emily and the fire. Every muscle in his body tense, trained to respond to danger instinctively. Years of experience as fire department chief weren't just about putting out fires. They were about reading them, predicting them, stopping them before they got out of control. And tonight, he read something that wasn't normal. The flames weren't just bigger, they were too bright, too eager, too fast. They moved differently, as though something had been added that didn't belong. The smell of the burning wood carried an unusual sharpness that set off another warning in his mind. Accelerant. Something had been poured over the logs. Something meant to make this fire burn far faster than it should. Emily looked at her father, her wide eyes shining in the firelight. "Dad, is it supposed to be like this?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. Her father didn't answer with words. Instead, he acted. He grabbed the fire blanket he always kept nearby for emergencies and draped it quickly over the pit's edge to smother the flare. Sparks popped and hissed, tiny bursts of heat whipping toward him, but he didn't flinch, not because he wasn't aware of the danger, but because he had trained to control it. The fire dimmed, smoke curling lazily into the night as the flames shrank back to a normal, manageable size. The logs hissed, but they no longer roared. His hands remained steady as he moved toward Emily, checking the blanket she'd wrapped around herself, ensuring it hadn't caught any stray sparks. Her eyes, wide with relief, met his. "You're safe," he said quietly, voice calm but firm. "Nothing touched you, but someone's been here. Someone tampered with the fire." Emily's lips parted in shock. "What? Who?" Her father's jaw tightened. "I don't know yet, but someone poured something on the logs earlier today. That fire was meant to be dangerous." He paused, scanning the yard with a practiced eye. The fencing, the shadows, the neighbors' houses across the street, all potential vantage points. His gaze fell briefly on the house across the fence. Curtains drawn, lights dimmed. Someone watching? Most likely. Too coincidental to be anything else. Emily's small hands clutched her father's arm. "Why would anyone?" she whispered. Her father crouched to meet her gaze, keeping his tone even, reassuring. "Sometimes people forget that rules don't justify danger. Sometimes someone wants to teach a lesson without thinking about the consequences." Emily nodded slowly, still shaken, but trusting him completely. She had learned early that her father's instincts weren't just about fire, they were about protection. He stayed beside her for a moment longer, checking that the surrounding area was safe. The fire pit now smoldered quietly, no longer threatening, only glowing faintly in the night. A gentle breeze carried the faint smell of smoke away from the house. The father knew what had to happen next. Evidence would need to be collected. Surveillance footage reviewed. Precautions taken to ensure that whoever thought they could create danger in their backyard learned that actions have consequences. As Emily watched the fire, now calm and predictable, she felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. She didn't yet know how much danger she had narrowly avoided. But she did know this: her father had stopped it before anything could happen, and in that moment, as the fire crackled quietly, she realized something else. The people who thought they could control her world through fear and rules had underestimated him. They had underestimated the fact that he saw and responded before disaster could strike. From behind a fence somewhere, someone may have been watching, smug and confident in their plan. But they hadn't counted on years of training, instincts honed by experience, or a father's watchful eye. Emily smiled faintly, the warmth of the night returning to her. The fire was safe now, the danger averted, but the lesson had already been learned. Some flames were meant to bring warmth and comfort. Some were meant to reveal the hidden threats lurking in the shadows. Tonight, she had seen both, and tomorrow they would make sure the hidden threat never returned. Years of training, years of instinct honed in situations most people would panic at, had prepared him for this moment. He had been called to fires that consumed entire buildings, to accidents that left lives hanging by a thread, to emergencies that arrived without warning. But this was different. This wasn't a call from the station. This wasn't an accident reported to dispatch. This was his home, his daughter, his responsibility, and the threat was invisible to everyone else. "Emily, don't move," he said calmly, already stepping between her and the fire. His tone carried authority, but it wasn't frightening. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what to do and wouldn't let anything go wrong. Emily's small hands gripped her blanket tighter. The fabric bunched around her fingers. She didn't fully understand what her father had seen, only that she trusted him completely. The flames roared higher than expected, heat pushing outward instead of upward. Normally, the fire pit produced a steady flame, licking the logs with controlled energy. Tonight, it surged unpredictably, too fast, too eager. The orange and red tongues of fire twisted, rolling, stretching, and snapping upward with a ferocity that was out of place for a few pieces of dry wood and kindling. His eyes caught the unnatural gleam on the surface of the logs, the way the flames leapt with a sudden enthusiasm, almost as if propelled by something more than heat. That wasn't normal. That wasn't wood and kindling. His breath tightened for a fraction of a second. That was accelerant, a thought that would have terrified anyone else barely registered as panic. He had seen this before. The way dangerous accelerants behaved, the way they twisted flames into unnatural forms, the way they forced heat outward in unpredictable bursts. His mind ran through scenarios in milliseconds: blanket, chair, surrounding furniture, the wind that had shifted slightly to the west, potential embers escaping to the grass. Instinct took over. He grabbed the fire blanket that rested nearby, a precaution he had insisted on keeping for years, even when Emily had rolled her eyes at him for being too careful. Now, it was exactly what he needed. He lunged with controlled speed, spreading the heavy flame-retardant material across the pit. The fire hissed and sputtered as it was smothered, releasing a cloud of smoke that rolled over the patio in lazy waves. Sparks popped faintly at the edges, tiny bursts of warning, but none escaped. The pit calmed immediately, reverting to a faint glow of coals, harmless now. The night fell silent again, but the quiet was different, too quiet. That silence carried weight, a warning, a confirmation that the potential danger had been far greater than Emily or anyone else could have imagined. Emily's hands shook slightly as she lowered her marshmallow stick, her knuckles white under the blanket. "Dad, what happened?" she asked, voice small, trembling, uncertain. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the last flickers of the subdued flames, and they checked his face for reassurance. He knelt beside her slowly, deliberately. examining the blanket that had protected her, her clothes, the chair. He ran his hands over the fabric, ensuring there were no singes, no unexpected heat. She was safe, completely. Not a single ember had touched her, not even a stray spark. Relief settled in his chest, but it was tempered by the sharp edge of suspicion and anger. His jaw tightened. "Someone messed with the fire pit," he said quietly, voice calm but firm. He let the words linger, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Emily blinked. Someone did this on purpose?" He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the yard, noting every shadow, every corner, every potential vantage point. "Yes, but don't worry, you're safe now. That's what matters most." His gaze drifted toward the fence line, toward the houses across the street, toward every angle someone could have observed them. There had been movement earlier today, subtle, almost imperceptible. A shadow here, a curtain twitching there, nothing he could have called immediate evidence, but now it all added up in a way that left no doubt. Emily shivered, and he pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, not out of necessity, but for comfort. "Dad, who would do that?" she whispered. He exhaled slowly. "Someone who thinks rules matter more than people, someone who doesn't understand the danger they create. But we'll find out who." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it, an unspoken promise that anyone trying to harm Emily, even indirectly, would face consequences. He surveyed the fire pit one more time. Everything looked ordinary again. Smoke had dissipated. Logs rested harmlessly in the pit, and the night air carried only the gentle scent of wood and summer grass. But he knew better. Nothing was ordinary tonight. Not the flames, not the movements ACR. The fence, not the subtle signals that someone had been there. He straightened and looked at Emily, offering a reassuring smile. "It's over for now, but tomorrow we make sure it never happens again." She nodded slowly, a mixture of awe and relief washing over her. She didn't need to understand everything. She didn't need to grasp the full weight of what had almost happened. She only needed to know her father had seen, had acted, had kept her safe. That knowledge was enough. The night returned to quiet, but now every flicker of light seemed charged with vigilance. The fire might have been smothered, but the lesson was clear. Some dangers can be hidden, some threats can be subtle, but with careful eyes, experience, and swift action, nothing harmful would touch her. And somewhere nearby, behind a fence, someone who had thought their plan was clever would soon learn exactly how wrong they had been. Emily leaned back in her chair, hugging the blanket to herself, and allowed the warmth of the evening to return, not from the fire, but from the certainty of safety, from the presence of someone who would never let harm reach her. The night was quiet, but the vigilance remained. Karen stood rigid behind her fence, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The evening air was warm, carrying faint scents of grass, wood smoke, and distant flowers, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the backyard across the way, where the small fire pit flickered, and where she believed a lesson had just begun. She had spent the day preparing herself, silently judging every choice made in the neighborhood. The backyard fire was the latest offense in her mind. To her, it wasn't just a fire, it was a symbol of negligence, a small act of carelessness that undermined the careful image she had worked so hard to maintain in her mind about the community. Neighbors were supposed to follow the RU. Rules weren't optional. Rules weren't negotiable. Rules weren't there for discussion. Karen had complained before, of course. She had filed emails with the HOA board, documenting the supposed infractions of neighbors, often pointing to small, inconsequential actions as if they were dangerous trends threatening the fabric of their carefully curated streets. She prided herself on noticing things others overlooked: a stray lawn ornament, a slightly overgrown hedge, a door left ajar after dark. Every detail mattered. Every detail contributed to the safety, image, and order of the community. At least that was how she saw it. Tonight, she had decided to watch. Just watch. Her plan wasn't to interfere, at least not in ways anyone could trace. But she wanted evidence. Evidence that her warnings had been ignored. Evidence that the people in that house, the ones who hadn't asked for permission for their backyard fire, were reckless, careless, deserving of a small dose of her disapproval. When the flames leapt higher than expected, she felt a thrill of satisfaction. She hadn't needed to touch anything. The fire seemed to have a mind of its own, leaping as if to prove her point. Finally, she thought, some natural consequence to remind them that rules were rules, that violations weren't without risk. She allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Yes, this was exactly what she had imagined. A dramatic, undeniable statement that people needed to learn boundaries. But her satisfaction faded quickly. The fire calmed, faster than it should have, smothered as if guided by an invisible hand. Sparks that should have traveled across the patio didn't. Heat that should have radiated outward was controlled. Every risk she had counted on disappeared almost before she had time to register it. Karen's brow furrowed. She leaned forward slightly, peering through the narrow slit of her fence. Who was doing this? Who could control fire so precisely, so decisively? Her mind raced. She had never encountered someone capable of predicting and stopping danger before it could happen. And then she saw him. The man by the fire pit moved with absolute certainty. His posture was deliberate, calculated, calm. He didn't hesitate. Every movement was precise, practiced, deliberate. It was the stance of someone who had faced flames far larger, far more dangerous, and had survived. Someone who had studied fire, understood its behavior, and could anticipate its whims. The kind of person who didn't panic when others would scream or freeze. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. This wasn't the show she had expected. This wasn't the chaos she had imagined. Her plan, her expectation that risk would naturally teach a lesson, had been thwarted, not by luck, not by chance, but by deliberate skill. Her thoughts raced, turning over possibilities. Could it have been a coincidence? A neighbor who happened to be unusually calm? No, the movements, the timing, the attention to detail. It was far too exact. This man understood fire the way she had never understood rules. She blinked, startled, as he crouched near the pit, checking the blanket around the girl, scanning the surroundings, ensuring that every potential hazard was neutralized. Not a word was spoken, no panic visible, but his eyes swept across the yard like radar, noting every corner, every shadow, every possible angle of danger. The satisfaction she had felt moments before evaporated entirely. Instead, she felt a prickling tension, that uncomfortable realization that she had underestimated someone, that her carefully constructed assumption that rules alone or fear alone could teach obedience was incomplete. There were forces she hadn't accounted for: training, preparation, instinct, and an unwavering dedication to safety. Aron's mind worked frantically. What could she do now? Could she intervene? Should she retreat? The fire was under control. The child was unharmed. The threat she had counted on as proof of negligence had been neutralized with ease. Her authority, her sense of judgment, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of a man who had seen danger in its rawest form and neutralized it before anyone else could react. She stepped back slightly, her arms loosening, her posture shifting. She felt smaller than she had moments before, less confident, suddenly aware of the gap between her own assumptions and reality. She had believed she could judge, control, and enforce, but now she realized that someone else's expertise exceeded hers in a way that made her own actions inconsequential. And in that quiet recognition, the unease began to settle. Her smugness, the smile she had allowed herself when the fire leapt, disappeared completely. She realized that the lesson she had thought she would deliver wasn't delivered at all, not by fire, not by judgment, not by oversight. It had been neutralized silently, efficiently by someone who cared more about safety than appearances. Karen's hands relaxed, though her mind continued to churn. The night air, the sounds of the fire pit now reduced to soft coals, the faint smell of smoke drifting into the yard. All of it reminded her that control wasn't hers to claim. She had watched, yes, she had judged, yes, but she had no power here. And yet she could not tear her eyes away. She had to see the man, to understand him, to gauge the extent of his knowledge, his calm, his ability to neutralize a threat that she had assumed would spiral. She watched every movement, every deliberate adjustment, every measured decision. She began to feel a mixture of awe and unease. Karen realized reluctantly that she had been observing the wrong target all along. She had focused on the fire, on the child, on what she perceived as negligence, but she had ignored the one variable that mattered most, a guardian capable of seeing danger before it could harm and stopping it without hesitation. The evening deepened. Stars appeared above, unnoticed by Karen, as her gaze remained fixed on the yard. The fire pit smoldered quietly now, warm but safe, controlled but alive. And in the quiet that followed, Karen understood something fundamental. Some forces could not be controlled by rules, by authority, or by observation alone. Some forces demanded respect. She stood behind her fence, silent, arms no longer crossed, a subtle tension in her shoulders. The lesson she had hoped to teach, the lesson she believed she had the power to enforce, had been rewritten before her eyes. She had misjudged the situation entirely. The man by the fire pit didn't flinch, didn't panic, didn't shout. He simply ensured safety, observed, and prepared for what might come next. And in that moment, Karen knew, quietly and uncomfortably, she was outmatched. Her plan, her authority, her assumptions, they had all failed. All she could do was watch. It wasn't announced to the neighborhood. There were no flashing lights, no gossip spreading through porches and driveways. Instead, it unfolded with a deliberate precision that only someone trained to handle emergencies and evidence could orchestrate. Emily's father moved with calm determination, drawing on decades of experience. This was more than just a fire pit incident. It was a potential crime, and he treated it accordingly. The first step was evidence. He documented everything in the backyard, the fire pit itself, the logs, the surrounding furniture, even the blanket Emily had used. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, capturing every detail, no matter how small. The camera lens lingered on subtle scorch marks on the woe. OD, tiny droplets of liquid residue that glinted faintly in the fading sunlight, hints that someone had tampered with the fire intentionally. Next came the security footage. Several neighbors had cameras, some installed for property protection, others for peace of mind. He reviewed hours of video from the day, carefully comparing timestamps, noting movements and shadows, identifying anyone who might have been near the backyard earlier in the afternoon. Every detail mattered. A figure lingering too long by a fence, a car parked suspiciously, a shadow crossing the yard. Each image was stored and labeled with precision, forming a pattern that no one could ignore. Then he collected correspondence. Emails from the HOA were compiled, revealing a trail of complaints that escalated over weeks. Initially, the messages were polite, even careful, noting minor rule violations. Over time, however, they became increasingly insistent, filled with subtle threats, judgment, and a sense of entitlement. It wasn't just a complaint about a fire pit. It was a record of obsession, a growing fixation that revealed intent. He reviewed everything twice, then again ensuring no detail was missed. Every photograph, every video clip, every email was cataloged, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. It became clear almost immediately this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a careless mistake. Someone had acted with intention, and they had done it in a way meant to provoke consequences. The next day, a formal notice was delivered. Karen received it personally. It was brief, professional, and unmistakably serious. She read the words, her confidence unwavering at first. She had believed her concerns, her vigilance, her watchful eye over the neighborhood gave her authority. She expected this to be another polite conversation, another chance to explain herself. She arrived at the designated location precisely on time, wearing her usual composed expression. She had rehearsed her answers in her mind. She believed she was untouchable. After all, she had simply followed the rules, or so she thought, until she saw the badge. The sight of it made her pause. A trained eye, polished and unmistakable, gleamed from a holder clipped to a uniform. Authority wasn't just present in the paperwork, it radiated from him, from the way he carried himself. This was someone who didn't need to raise a voice or slam a gavel to be heard. His presence alone reshaped the room, pulling attention and respect with an almost imperceptible gravity. Emily's father stepped forward, calm but unwavering. His eyes didn't flinch. They didn't judge with petty emotion. They simply observed, cataloged, and processed every detail of Karen's posture, expression, and demeanor. His reputation wasn't just in the badge or the uniform. It was in the decades of experience that gave him the ability to see through excuses and facades, to recognize intent where others might see only coincidence. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls themselves leaned inward. Karen realized in that instant that her confidence had been premature. The certainty she had carried into the meeting, the belief that she was simply a concerned neighbor, that her complaints were righteous and justified, cracked under the weight of presence and authority. He gestured to a table and Karen sat. Between them lay the collected evidence, photographs of the fire pit, security footage labeled by time, emails documenting escalating complaints. Each piece was carefully arranged, showing a clear narrative, deliberate tampering, intent, and a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed. For a moment, she searched his face for softness, for leniency, for a hint that her years of asserting control over the neighborhood would carry any weight. There was none. His expression was steady, controlled, professional, the kind of expression that left no room for evasion. Every gesture reinforced the truth that actions had consequences. and that in the presence of expertise and authority, pretense and manipulation fell away. Karen's mind raced. She had believed rules alone were power. She had believed compliance, or at least the appearance of it, gave her control, but she had underestimated knowledge, skill, and the protective instinct of someone who understood danger intimately. The fire department chief spoke, not angrily, not accusingly, but with clarity and precision. Every word was measured, documenting the evidence, the sequence of events, the potential consequences. He asked questions, recorded responses, and left no ambiguity. Karen answered carefully, aware that every phrase was now part of a permanent record. Every hesitation, every slight misstatement could and would be noted. Time seemed to stretch in the room. Minutes became hours in perception. Karen's confidence eroded slowly but steadily, replaced by the realization that this investigation was no longer about neighborly rules or appearances. This was about responsibility, intent, and safety, and in that realization, she felt the true weight of authority, quiet, unyielding, and completely undeniable. When the meeting concluded, Karen rose, her posture rigid, her composure intact but fragile. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that her obsession with rules had blinded her to reality. Authority, knowledge, and vigilance weren't things that could be intimidated, they were earned and demonstrated. Outside, the air was warm and calm. The neighborhood carried on as usual, oblivious to the quiet drama that had unfolded. But inside, in that small, measured room, a lesson had been delivered that could not be undone. Rules, after LL, could guide behavior, but skill, experience, and moral responsibility ensured consequences when those rules were misused. Karen stepped out of the building, aware that she had been measured, assessed, and found wanting. The weight of authority, professional expertise, and protective instinct had dwarfed her confidence, leaving her with an uncomfortable truth: power without responsibility is fragile, and intent can never outweigh safety. Emily's father returned home that evening, the quiet calm of the neighborhood restored, the threat neutralized, and the lesson delivered without a single raised voice, without unnecessary confrontation, and without harm. The fire pit sat safely in the backyard, a reminder that vigilance, preparation, and knowledge were the true guardians of peace. Not whispered gossip or idle speculation, but undeniable, verifiable facts. News of the fire pit incident, the deliberate tampering, and the swift professional intervention spread quietly through the neighborhood, reaching every corner, every porch, every mailbox. Unlike rumors that twist with exaggeration, this story carried the weight of evidence, photographs, video footage, and emails that left no room for interpretation. The HOA, long a pillar of assumed authority, suddenly appeared fragile. Meetings that had once been compulsory were postponed indefinitely. Policies that had been rigid, inflexible, and enforced without consideration were paused, reviewed, and revised. Safety protocols were rewritten by professionals, people who had real training, practical experience, and a true understanding of risk, not by volunteers more concerned with appearances than actual protection. Across the neighborhood, residents began to realize how skewed their previous assumptions had been. They remembered Karen's complaints, the notes posted in newsletters, the stern reminders about proper conduct in yards, driveways, and back patios. They had complied, perhaps begrudgingly, perhaps because they trusted her judgment. But now, looking back, those directives felt petty, exaggerated, and disconnected from reality. Apologies began to appear. Some were quiet, spoken when no one else was listening. A neighbor passing by Emily's house, lowering their gaze in acknowledgement, muttering, "I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened." Others were public and deliberate. A note pinned to a community board, a brief acknowledgement at the next meeting, an open conversation about lessons learned and mistakes made. The tone of the neighborhood shifted subtly but meaningfully. People no longer assumed rules were absolute. They understood context mattered. They realized that vigilance and safety could not be replaced with officiousness or personal judgment. Emily noticed the shift more than anyone. She saw neighbors linger longer on walks. They stopped for small conversations, asking how she was doing, genuinely concerned about her well-being, rather than checking if she was following the rules. People who had once avoided eye contact or waved politely from a distance now engaged, smiled warmly, and invited her to join casual activities. The gestures were small but sincere, a neighbor bringing a cup of lemonade to the driveway, another stopping by to chat about a shared hobby, someone else pausing to compliment the flowers she had helped plant. These acts, simple and unremarkable on the surface, conveyed a powerful truth. The community had reoriented itself around care rather than control. The park became a symbol of the change. Where once it had been merely a destination, now it was a gathering place. Families lingered longer, children played freely, and adults conversed without the usual undercurrent of judgment. Emily often stopped to watch the interactions, realizing that this new RGY came not from formal rules but from shared awareness and mutual respect. People had learned that community wasn't about policing every action. It was about protecting one another, looking out for safety while fostering a sense of belonging. Karen, meanwhile, felt the shift most acutely. Her carefully constructed authority, her reputation for vigilance, and her self-appointed role as the moral arbiter of the neighborhood were all quietly undermined. Conversations she had thought influential were no longer followed with deference. Her emails were now scrutinized and cross-referenced with facts and evidence. Her presence at gatherings drew polite acknowledgement, but the unspoken power she had assumed was gone. Authority, the kind she had exercised through intimidation and complaint, was being replaced with reasoned oversight and communal responsibility. It was a subtle, almost invisible reckoning. Karen wasn't publicly humiliated. There was no dramatic confrontation. The consequences were quieter, more permanent. People no longer deferred to her judgment unquestioningly. Her influence waned, replaced by an understanding that experience, expertise, and ethical action mattered more than rules enforced from a position of personal power. Emily felt the results of this change every day. It was in the small gestures: a neighbor checking that her wheelchair could pass safely along the sidewalk, someone offering assistance without expectation, another inviting her to participate in community events. These acts were deliberate, thoughtful, and entirely voluntary. They weren't enforced, they were chosen. And for Emily, they spoke louder than any rule or complaint ever could. Even the children seemed to sense it. The playground near the park was livelier, freer, less rigid. Games weren't interrupted by arbitrary rules or grown-up policing. Older kids helped younger ones, everyone looked out for one another, and Emily's wheelchair was simply another part of the environment, a tool for movement, not a marker of difference. The adults, too, adapted. HOA boards now included trained safety officers and experts rather than volunteers whose authority had once been self-assumed. Fire safety workshops, first aid demonstrations, and educational sessions became a regular part of neighborhood planning. Discussions shifted from rigid compliance to proactive care, how to make the environment safer, how to ensure accessibility, and how to prevent incidents before they became emergencies. Emily's father, quietly proud, observed these changes from a distance. He saw the subtle ways the community had recalibrated its priorities, how safety and awareness had begun to take precedence over arbitrary judgment and fear. He watched Emily interact with her neighbors with confidence and trust, knowing that the danger from before had not only been averted but had catalyzed meaningful change. For Emily, the neighborhood no longer felt like a place of rules and restrictions. It had become a place of vigilance and empathy, of care and participation. People didn't just wave as she rolled by. They acknowledged her presence, checked in on her well-being, and included her in the rhythm of daily life. And that, Emily realized, was the true reckoning, not punishment for a single person, not retribution, but a shift in understanding, a redirection of attention, and a reinforcement of what truly mattered: safety, respect, and community. The fire pit in her backyard remained, now fully regulated, watched, and safe. But it no longer symbolized fear or potential harm. It symbolized awareness, action, and the ability of a community to learn from near disaster. And Emily knew, as she watched neighbors pass by, greeting one another with genuine warmth, that this neighborhood had finally learned the lesson that rules alone could never teach, that safety and care are always stronger than fear and control. Weeks had passed since the incident with the fire pit. Weeks that felt longer than they actually were because every day had been filled with small, deliberate changes. The neighborhood had begun to breathe again, slowly shedding the tension that had gripped it after the fire incident. It wasn't just Emily or her family who had learned from what had happened. Everyone had. The rules, once wielded like weapons by the HOA, had been reconsidered, refined, and clarified. Safety, responsibility, and common sense were now at the center of every decision. That afternoon, Emily's father wheeled the fire pit to the center of the backyard with careful precision. This time, everything was official. Permits had been obtained, neighbors had been notified, and a few safety measures were in place that weren't necessary before, but were reassuring nonetheless. Fire extinguishers stood at the ready, a bucket of water and sand sat nearby, and blankets were folded safely on a nearby bench. Emily helped arrange chairs around the pit. She rolled her wheelchair into position, the familiar hum of the wheels along the patio's stone surface comforting. She had grown more confident in these past weeks, understanding that precautions and awareness could coexist with enjoyment and relaxation. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and warm summer breezes, and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. Birds sang from the trees at the edges of the yard, their cheerful melodies adding to the sense of calm and reassurance. Her father struck the first match with a practiced flick of the wrist. The flame caught the kindling immediately, climbing steadily but predictably. The fire danced just as it should, gentle, controlled, and perfectly safe. Emily watched, eyes wide with fascination, as the flames curled upward and then settled into a steady, comforting glow. She grabbed a marshmallow stick and carefully lowered the treat toward the fire. The golden brown sugar began to caramelize, and the smell of toasted marshmallow drifted into the air. She laughed softly when the sticky sweetness caught on her fingertips, a small sound of pure joy that made her father smile. "Perfect timing," he said, watching her carefully but relaxed. Unlike weeks ago, he didn't feel tension coiled in his shoulders. There was no lingering fear of hidden hazards, no need to anticipate every possible threat. This fire was controlled, predictable, and entirely safe. It was exactly what a fire should be. The neighbors began to arrive cautiously at first. At first it was just a few families quietly observing from their own yards. Then more appeared, drawn by the smell of the fire, the laughter of children, and the sense that the household across the street had found a way to turn what had once been tension and fear into something positive. Children waved at Emily as they approached, and she waved back enthusiastically. The older neighbors smiled and nodded politely but sincerely, acknowledging that safety could coexist with enjoyment and that rules could guide rather than punish. Soon a small crowd had gathered. The air was alive with soft conversation and laughter. The fire pit no longer symbolized danger, rebellion, or threat. It symbolized community, vigilance, and shared responsibility. Families took turns roasting marshmallows, telling stories, and quietly checking in with one another. Conversations drifted from the mundane to the heartfelt: school events, gardening tips, summer plans. No one spoke about past conflicts, but the sense of shared awareness hung in the air like an invisible thread, connecting everyone present. Emily's father leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her carefully. He had always been protective, but now his vigilance felt different, calm, assured, knowing that the community itself had embraced responsibility. He felt pride swelling quietly in his chest. Not because he had prevented a disaster, that was only part of it, but because the neighborhood collectively had learned something essential: the importance of balance between rules and empathy, authority and kindness. Emily turned toward him, marshmallow stick in hand, a sticky grin on her face. "Look, Dad, perfectly toasted," she said, holding it up proudly. He chuckled, shaking his head gently. "Not bad," he said, "not bad at all." The fire crackled softly, the warmth of it extending beyond the flames into the hearts of everyone present. Some fires destroy, some teach, and some, when handled carefully and with respect, bring people together. This one was all three in a sense. It had started as potential destruction, had taught lessons of vigilance and responsibility, and now fostered connection, understanding, and trust. Karen, meanwhile, was absent. She had retreated behind closed curtains, her authority quietly diminished, her confidence eroded. The neighborhood no longer looked to her as a measure of safety or propriety. Her absence was unremarkable, because the community had discovered that vigilance didn't need to be driven by fear or obsession. It could come from shared knowledge, care, and responsibility. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the yard, Emily leaned back in her wheelchair and watched the flames dance. She noticed the reflection of firelight in the faces around her: neighbors, friends, family, all of them calm, happy, and present. She realized that the fire didn't need to be wild or threatening to be beautiful. Its warmth could be shared without risk. Its light could illuminate more than the physical space. It could illuminate hearts. Her father reached over and gently adjusted her blanket. "You see," he said softly, "this is what fire should feel like. Warm, safe, and shared." Emily nodded, feeling the truth of it. The fire pit was more than just logs and flames. It was a symbol of everything they had learned: about vigilance, about responsibility, about protection, about trust. And as the last light of day faded, The flames flickered gently, steady and reassuring, a quiet testament to lessons learned and a community renewed. Emily smiled, holding her perfectly toasted marshmallow and realizing that danger could be met with preparation, fear could be replaced with calm, and even the smallest flames could bring warmth and light when treated with care. Some fires destroy, others teach, and some, when handled correctly, bring people together instead of burning everything down. Tonight, Emily's fire did all three safely, beautifully, and completely.